When I decided to learn English at home, I felt a little lost. I didn't know where to start or what to do first. But then I realized that the best way to learn was to make English part of my daily routine. I started with small things like labeling objects in my house. For example, I put a note on the refrigerator that said fridge and another on the mirror that said mirror. Seeing these words every day helped me remember them. I also changed the language on my phone to English. At first, it was a bit difficult because I didn't understand some words. But with time, I got used to it and learned new vocabulary. I also started listening to English music and try to understand the lyrics. It was fun because I enjoyed the songs while improving my listening skills. Another thing that helped me was watching TV shows and movies in English. At first, I used subtitles in my native language, but later I switched to English subtitles. This way, I could read and listen at the same time. It was hard at first, but I didn't give up. Every day, I understood more and more. Speaking was the most difficult part for me. Since I didn't have anyone to practice with, I started talking to myself in English. I described what I was doing like, I am cooking pasta or I am cleaning my room. It felt strange, but it helped me a lot. The more I practiced, the more confident I became. Learning English at home is possible if you practice every day. You don't need to be perfect, you just need to try. Making English part of your life will help you improve quickly. In the next chapter, I will talk about how I created a study plan to learn even faster. Chapter 2: Creating a Simple Study Plan. After making English part of my daily routine, I realized I needed a study plan. Without a plan, I was learning randomly, and I wanted to be more organized. So, I created a simple schedule to practice English every day. I divided my time into listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Each skill was important, and I wanted to improve all of them. First, I set a goal to listen to English for at least 30 minutes a day. I listened to podcasts, songs, and YouTube videos. I didn't understand everything at first, but I tried to focus on key words. Sometimes I repeated what I heard to practice pronunciation. This method helped me a lot. For speaking, I practiced by reading aloud and talking to myself. I also used language exchange apps to talk with native speakers. At first, I was nervous, but I reminded myself that making mistakes was part of learning. Every time I spoke, I became more comfortable and confident. Reading was also an important part of my plan. I started with short and simple texts, like children's books and news articles. Whenever I found a new word, I wrote it down in a notebook. Then, I used it in my own sentences to remember it better. Finally, I practiced writing by keeping a daily journal in English. I wrote about my day, my thoughts, and my goals. Writing helped me organize my ideas and learn new words. Having a study plan made learning easier and more effective. In the next chapter, I will share how I overcame my fear of speaking. Chapter 3: Overcoming the fear of speaking. One of the biggest challenges I faced was speaking English. I was afraid of making mistakes and sounding silly. I worried that people would judge me, so I avoided speaking as much as possible. But then I realized that fear was stopping me from improving. I needed to change my mindset. I started by reminding myself that mistakes were normal. Every time I made a mistake, I told myself, this is how I learn. Instead of feeling embarrassed, I try to learn from my errors. I also watched videos of people learning new languages. Seeing others struggle and improve motivated me to keep going. To gain confidence, I practiced speaking in front of a mirror. I pretended I was having a conversation with someone. I asked myself questions and answered them. This exercise helped me get used to speaking without pressure. I also recorded myself and listened to my pronunciation. Another technique that helped was shadowing. I listened to native speakers and repeated what they said immediately. This helped me improve my pronunciation and rhythm. At first, I couldn't keep up, but with practice, I got better. Finally, I joined online groups where people practiced English together. Speaking with others who were also learning made me feel more comfortable. Everyone made mistakes and nobody judged me. Little by little, my fear disappeared. In the next chapter, I will talk about using English in real-life situations. Chapter 4. Using English in real-life situations. After overcoming my fear of speaking, I wanted to use English in real situations. Since I couldn't travel to an English-speaking country, I found other ways to practice. The first thing I did was order food in English at international restaurants. Even if the staff spoke my language, I forced myself to speak English. I also started thinking in English. Instead of translating in my head, I tried to form sentences naturally. For example, when I saw something, I described it in English. If I was walking in the park, I thought, the trees are beautiful today. This simple habit made a big difference. Another method I used was writing messages and emails in English. Whenever I had the chance, I communicated with people in English. I also left comments on YouTube videos and social media posts. Writing in English daily improved my confidence and vocabulary. I found online communities where people discuss topics in English. I participated in conversations about books, movies, and hobbies. This was a fun way to practice while learning new things. Interacting with real people helped me use English naturally. The more I used English, the easier it became. I stopped worrying about mistakes and focused on communication. In the final chapter, I will share how I made English a permanent part of my life. Chapter 5. Making English a lifelong habit. After months of practicing, English became a natural part of my life. I no longer saw it as something I had to study. It was simply part of my daily routine. The key to success was consistency. I didn't stop practicing, even when I felt lazy or unmotivated. I continued watching movies, reading books, and talking to people in English. I also set new goals to keep improving. For example, I challenged myself to read a full novel in English. It took time, but I felt proud when I finished it. I also realized that learning never stops. There are always new words, expressions, and cultural aspects to discover. Instead of focusing on perfection, I focused on progress. Every little improvement made me feel more confident. To stay motivated, I celebrated my achievements. Whenever I reached a goal, I rewarded myself. I also reminded myself why I started learning English in the first place. Having a strong reason kept me going. Speaking English at home was the first step in my journey. Now, I feel comfortable using English anywhere. If you're starting to learn English, remember, practice every day, don't be afraid of mistakes, and enjoy the process. Learning a language is a lifelong adventure. Chapter 6, Expanding My Vocabulary Naturally. One of the most frustrating parts of learning English at home was realizing that my vocabulary was too limited. I could understand basic words and phrases, but when I tried to express myself, I felt stuck. I needed a way to learn new words without memorizing long lists, so I decided to focus on learning words in context. Instead of just reading random words, I looked for words in sentences and real-life situations. This method helped me understand how words were used naturally. To improve my vocabulary, I started reading articles, blogs, and even social media posts in English. Whenever I found a new word, I didn't just look up the meaning. I wrote down the entire sentence where I found it. This helped me remember how to use it in real conversations. I also tried to guess the meaning before checking the dictionary. This simple habit made me more confident in understanding new words. Another technique that worked for me was learning word families. For example, if I learned the word happy, I also learned happiness, unhappy, and happily. This way, I expanded my vocabulary faster and was able to use different forms of the same word naturally. I also practiced making sentences with these words every day. The more I used them, the easier they became to remember. I also realized that repetition was key to learning new vocabulary. Just seeing a word once wasn't enough. I needed to use it multiple times in different contexts. To reinforce my learning, I created flashcards with words and phrases and reviewed them regularly. I also used new words when writing my journal or talking to myself in English. This helped me make those words a permanent part of my vocabulary. Expanding my vocabulary took time, but it was worth the effort. I no longer felt limited when speaking or writing in English. I could express myself more clearly and confidently. In the next chapter, I will talk about how I improve my pronunciation to sound more natural. Chapter 7. Improving my pronunciation step by step. At the beginning of my English journey, pronunciation was a big challenge for me. I knew many words, but when I said them out loud, they didn't sound correct. Native speakers sometimes had trouble understanding me, which made me feel insecure. I realized that improving my pronunciation was just as important as learning new words, so I decided to focus on this skill. The first thing I did was listen carefully to native speakers. I paid attention to how they pronounced words and how their intonation changed in sentences. I noticed that pronunciation was not just about individual sounds. It was also about rhythm, stress, and the natural flow of speech. I started mimicking their way of speaking, trying to copy their tone and expression. This technique, known as shadowing, became one of my favorite ways to practice. To improve specific sounds, I watched videos that explained the differences between similar sounds in English. For example, I practiced the difference between ship and sheep, or think and sink. I repeated these words many times until my pronunciation improved. I also recorded myself speaking and compared my pronunciation to that of native speakers. This helped me identify the sounds I needed to work on. Another method that helped me was practicing tongue twisters. At first, they were very difficult, but they forced me to pronounce words clearly and accurately. Some of my favorites were "She sells seashells by the seashore" and "How can a clam cram in a clean cream can?" These exercises help me improve my clarity and speed when speaking. With time and practice, my pronunciation improved significantly. I stopped feeling nervous about speaking, and people started understanding me better. In the next chapter, I will talk about how I train my brain to think in English instead of translating from my native language. Chapter 8: Training my brain to think in English. One of the biggest obstacles I faced when learning English was the constant habit of translating everything in my head. Whenever I tried to speak, I first thought of the sentence in my native language and then translated it into English. This process made me slow and sometimes led to awkward sentences. I knew that if I wanted to speak fluently, I needed to train my brain to think directly in English. To achieve this, I started with simple exercises. I looked around my room and named objects in English. Instead of thinking, "This is a table" in my language, and then translating it, I immediately said, "This is a table" in English. I did this every day, and it helped me create a direct connection between words and their meanings without using my native language. I also started describing my actions in English throughout the day. For example, when making coffee, I would think, "I am boiling water" or "I am pouring milk." These small sentences became automatic, and over time, I noticed that my brain was processing information directly in English. I didn't have to translate anymore. It just came naturally. Another technique that helped me was talking to myself in English. I had imaginary conversations about different topics. Sometimes I even argued with myself, asking questions and answering them. This may sound funny, but it really helped me think faster and form sentences naturally. I also practiced telling stories in English, which forced me to organize my thoughts in the language. Thinking in English completely changed the way I spoke. I no longer felt stuck trying to find the right words because they came to me naturally. In the next chapter, I will share how I developed the confidence to hold conversations with native speakers. Chapter 9: Gaining Confidence to Speak with Native Speakers. Even after months of practicing English at home, I still felt nervous about speaking with native speakers. I often hesitated, worried that my accent would be too strong or that I would make embarrassing mistakes. Every time I had the chance to speak with someone in English, my mind went blank and I struggled to form sentences. This fear of making mistakes held me back, but I knew I couldn't let it stop me from improving. After all, the only way to become fluent was by practicing with real people. So, I made a decision. I would start speaking no matter how imperfect my English was. At first, I started small. Instead of jumping into long conversations, I focused on saying simple phrases in English whenever I could. For example, when ordering food at a restaurant, I practiced saying, "I'd like a coffee, please," instead of pointing at the menu. I also made an effort to greet people in English, whether it was saying good morning to a neighbor or thank you at a store. These small interactions helped me get used to speaking without feeling overwhelmed. The more I did it, the more comfortable I became. To take my practice further, I joined online communities where people practiced English together. I found language exchange partners who wanted to learn my native language, so we helped each other. Speaking with other learners was a great way to build confidence because I knew they understood the struggle of learning a new language. Since they were also making mistakes, I felt less pressure to be perfect. We laughed at our errors, corrected each other, and most importantly, we kept talking. These conversations made me realize that communication was more important than perfection. I also practiced speaking with AI chatbots and voice assistants. I asked them questions, listened to their responses, and tried to keep a conversation going. At first, it felt strange talking to a computer, but it was a great way to practice pronunciation and sentence structure without feeling judged. It was like having a conversation partner available 24/7. This gave me the confidence to speak more naturally when I interacted with real people. Over time, I noticed a big change in my mindset. I stopped focusing on my mistakes and started focusing on communication. I realized that native speakers don't expect perfect English. They just appreciate the effort. The more I spoke, the more confident I became. I no longer hesitated as much, and I started enjoying conversations instead of fearing them. Speaking English was no longer just something I was learning. It was becoming a part of my life. Chapter 10. Staying motivated and never giving up. Learning English is a long and challenging journey, and there were many times when I felt frustrated. Some days, I felt like I was making great progress, while other days, it seemed like I wasn't improving at all. There were moments when I wanted to give up, especially when I struggled to understand fast conversations or when I couldn't find the right words. But every time I felt like quitting, I reminded myself why I started. I wanted to be able to communicate with people from different countries, watch movies without subtitles, and travel without feeling lost. That goal kept me going even when the journey was tough. To stay motivated, I set small and realistic goals for myself. Instead of saying, I want to be fluent, which felt overwhelming, I focused on achievable goals like, I want to learn 10 new words this week, or I want to have a 5-minute conversation in English. Every time I reached a goal, no matter how small, I felt a sense of accomplishment. These little victories kept me motivated and made me excited to continue learning. I also started keeping track of my progress by writing down new words I learned, recording myself speaking, and noting the moments when I successfully used English in real situations. Seeing my improvement over time was a huge confidence booster. Another thing that helped me stay motivated was surrounding myself with English as much as possible. I changed the language on my phone, computer, and social media accounts to English. I followed English-speaking YouTubers, listened to podcasts, and watched TV shows without subtitles. By doing this, I made English a part of my daily life instead of just something I studied. Even when I wasn't actively learning, I was still absorbing the language naturally. This constant exposure helped me improve without even realizing it. One of the most important lessons I learned was that consistency is the key to success. Even if I only practiced for 10 or 15 minutes a day, the important thing was to keep going. There were days when I felt tired or unmotivated, but I reminded myself that every small effort counted. I also learned to be patient with myself. Progress doesn't happen overnight, and mistakes are a natural part of learning. Instead of getting frustrated, I started seeing mistakes as opportunities to improve. Every time I mispronounced a word or used incorrect grammar, I learned something new. Looking back, I realize how much I have grown. Speaking English no longer feels like an impossible dream. I may not be perfect, but I can communicate, express my thoughts, and understand others. That, to me, is true success. Learning English at home was one of the best decisions I ever made, and I am proud of how far I've come. And the best part? I know that if I keep practicing, I will only get better. If I could do it, anyone can. Chapter 11. Overcoming the fear of making mistakes. One of the biggest obstacles I faced when learning English at home was my fear of making mistakes. Every time I tried to speak, I worried that I would say something incorrect or that people would laugh at me. This fear held me back more than anything else. Even though I had learned many words and practiced daily, I still hesitated to speak because I wanted to be perfect. But then I realized something important. Nobody speaks perfectly all the time, not even native speakers. Making mistakes is a normal and necessary part of learning. To overcome this fear, I started changing my mindset. Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, I saw them as opportunities to learn. Every time I used the wrong word or struggled to pronounce something, I reminded myself that I was improving. I also reminded myself that most people don't care if I make mistakes. They appreciate the effort. This shift in thinking helped me feel more confident and willing to take risks in my conversations. Another strategy that helped me was recording myself speaking in English. At first, it was uncomfortable listening to my own voice, but it allowed me to hear my pronunciation and identify areas for improvement. I compared my recordings to native speakers and worked on correcting small mistakes. Over time, I noticed significant progress. I also realized that the mistakes I feared so much were not as bad as I thought. Practicing with patient and supportive people also made a big difference. I joined online communities where learners helped each other without judgment. I also found language partners who encouraged me rather than criticized me. Having a positive environment made it easier to speak without fear. Slowly, my confidence grew, and I became more comfortable making mistakes because I knew they were helping me get better. Now, I no longer let the fear of mistakes stop me. I know that every error is a step toward improvement. Instead of avoiding difficult conversations, I embrace them as challenges. I remind myself that fluency is not about speaking perfectly. It's about communicating effectively. The more I practice, the more I grow. Chapter 12. Thinking in English instead of translating. One of the biggest breakthroughs in my learning journey happened when I stopped translating everything in my head. In the beginning, every time I wanted to say something in English, I would think of the sentence in my native language first, then try to translate it word by word. This made speaking slow and frustrating. Sometimes the translations didn't make sense, and I struggled to form correct sentences. I knew that if I wanted to speak fluently, I had to start thinking in English. To do this, I began with simple exercises. I named objects around me in English instead of my native language. When I walked around my house, I would say in my mind, "This is a table, that is a chair, I am opening the door." It was a small habit, but it trained my brain to process English naturally. Over time, I started forming simple sentences in my head without translating. Another effective technique was describing my daily activities in English. For example, when cooking, I would think, "I am cutting vegetables, I need to boil water," or "This food smells delicious." At first, it was difficult, but the more I practiced, the easier it became. I also try to narrate my thoughts in English throughout the day. If I was feeling tired, I would think, I am exhausted. If I was excited, I would say, I can't wait for tomorrow. This habit helped me become more comfortable thinking in English. Reading and watching content in English also helped me stop translating. I focused on understanding the general meaning instead of translating every word. At first, I struggled, but soon I started recognizing phrases and understanding them naturally. I also listened to English audio and try to repeat sentences without thinking in my native language. This improved my listening skills and helped me think faster in English. Now, I no longer translate everything in my head. My thoughts flow more naturally, and speaking has become much easier. By training my brain to think in English, I have taken a huge step toward fluency. I still make mistakes, but I am much more confident than before. Chapter 13. Expanding my vocabulary in a fun way. When I first started learning English, I focused on memorizing vocabulary lists. I would write down new words and repeat them over and over. However, I quickly realized that this method was boring and ineffective. Even though I was learning many words, I struggled to use them in conversations. I needed a better way to expand my vocabulary and remember new words naturally. One of the best methods I discovered was learning words in context. Instead of just memorizing a list, I read short stories and paid attention to how words were used in real sentences. This helped me understand their meaning and remember them more easily. I also watched TV shows and movies with subtitles, noting down useful phrases and expressions. This made learning new words fun and practical. I also started using flashcards, but in a different way. Instead of just writing the English word and its translation, I included an image or an example sentence. For instance, instead of writing apple equals manzana, I wrote, I eat an apple every morning. This method helped me connect words with real situations instead of just memorizing translations. Another fun way I expanded my vocabulary was by playing word games and using language learning apps. Games like crossword puzzles, word searches, and vocabulary challenges made learning enjoyable. I also practiced writing short stories or journal entries in English, which forced me to use new words creatively. By making vocabulary learning fun and interactive, I retained words more effectively. I no longer felt overwhelmed by long word lists. Instead, I learned naturally through reading, watching, and playing. This approach made English feel more like a part of my life rather than just a subject to study. Chapter 14. Using English in Everyday Life. One of the most important steps in my learning journey was making English a part of my daily life. I realized that if I only practiced for an hour and then switched back to my native language, I wasn't improving as fast as I wanted. So, I decided to immerse myself in English as much as possible, even when I was alone at home. I started by changing my phone, computer, and social media settings to English. This forced me to read and interact with English every day. Whenever I needed to search for something online, I did it in English instead of my native language. This small change helped me learn new words and expressions without much effort. I also replaced my usual entertainment with English content. Instead of watching movies with subtitles in my language, I watched them with English subtitles. I listened to English podcasts while doing chores and played English songs, trying to understand the lyrics. By surrounding myself with the language, I improved my comprehension without even realizing it. One of the best decisions I made was talking to myself in English. If I was cooking, I would say, "Now I am cutting vegetables." If I was thinking about my day, I would narrate it in English. This habit helped me practice speaking without needing a conversation partner. By integrating English into my everyday life, I turned learning into a natural habit. It no longer felt like something I had to do. It became something I enjoyed. This consistency helped me make progress faster than I ever imagined. Chapter 15: Creating an English-only environment at home. One of the biggest challenges in learning English at home is staying consistent and fully immersing yourself in the language. After months of practicing different techniques, I realized that the key to faster improvement was creating an English-only environment. This meant surrounding myself with English in every possible way, listening, reading, writing, and speaking until my brain started thinking in English naturally. At first, it felt strange, but over time, I noticed incredible progress in my fluency and confidence. To make my home an English-friendly space, I started by labeling objects around my house with their English names. I put sticky notes on the refrigerator, mirror, desk, and even my phone with words like window, laptop, toothbrush, and microwave. Every time I saw these labels, I read them aloud and repeated them in sentences. For example, if I saw the note on the door, I would say, "I'm opening the door," or "I will close the door now." This small habit helped reinforce vocabulary in my daily routine without extra effort. I also changed the language settings on all my devices, including my phone, laptop, and TV. At first, it was a bit frustrating because I had to figure out new words, but soon I became comfortable navigating everything in English. This constant exposure forced me to read, think, and interact with English daily. I also followed English-speaking influencers and subscribed to YouTube channels about topics I enjoyed, so every time I used social media, I was learning passively. Another powerful method was adopting the no translation rule. I decided to stop translating words into my native language and instead learn them through context. For example, instead of thinking, "What is the word for mesa in English?" I would look at a table, point to it, and say, this is a table. This mindset shift made my brain start processing English like a native speaker. Over time, I noticed that I could understand and respond in English much faster. Finally, I made English the main language of communication in my daily life. Whenever I texted friends who also wanted to improve their English, I encouraged them to chat only in English. If I had to write a grocery list, plan my schedule, or journal about my day, I did in English. The more I used the language in real-life situations, the more natural it became. By creating an immersive English environment at home, I transformed my learning experience and made English an essential part of my everyday life.